He thought he was about to turn an ordinary woman into the biggest joke of the evening, but before the final curtain fell, his own pride would become the only thing everyone remembered. The Grand Crescent Theater stood like a crown in the heart of downtown Chicago, its towering columns glowing beneath golden lights as luxury cars lined the entrance and elegantly dressed guests stepped onto the red carpet with eager anticipation. Tonight was the annual Harmony for Hope Gala, a charity concert so prestigious that critics, philanthropists, celebrated musicians, and influential community leaders traveled from across the country to attend. Every ticket had been sold for months. Every seat inside the magnificent auditorium promised a perfect view of an unforgettable evening. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors while the soft fragrance of fresh white lilies welcomed every arriving guest. Behind the elegance, however, another world quietly worked without applause. Stagehands adjusted enormous crimson curtains, lighting technicians tested spotlights, orchestra members tuned priceless instruments, and housekeeping staff moved carefully through the hallways, making certain every detail reflected excellence before the audience entered. Among them was Grace Bennett, a 38-year-old woman dressed in a simple navy housekeeping uniform. Her light brown hair was tied neatly into a modest bun, and her calm blue eyes carried a peaceful warmth that most people never bothered to notice. She quietly replaced fresh flowers beside dressing rooms, straightened music stands, polished brass railings, and wished every performer a wonderful evening with the same gentle smile. To nearly everyone inside the theater, she was simply another employee whose work faded into the background before the curtain ever rose. Grace never complained. She never sought attention. She carried herself with quiet dignity, as though she had already learned that the world often overlooked its greatest treasures. Across the backstage corridor, Victor Hayes surveyed the final preparations with unmistakable confidence. At 56 years old, the celebrated music director had built a reputation for demanding perfection from every artist who appeared beneath his stage lights. His tailored black tuxedo, neatly combed silver hair, and commanding presence drew immediate respect wherever he walked. Assistants hurried to answer every request before he finished speaking, while performers straightened their posture whenever he entered the room. Victor believed excellence belonged only to those who earned the spotlight, and he rarely looked twice at the people working quietly behind it. As the orchestra completed its final rehearsal, an anxious production assistant rushed toward Victor holding a cell phone. The featured soprano's flight had been delayed by severe weather, making it impossible for her to arrive before the opening performance. The carefully planned program suddenly stood on the edge of disaster. Producers exchanged worried glances. Musicians whispered among themselves. Volunteers hurried through the backstage hallways searching for impossible solutions. Victor glanced impatiently at his watch before dismissing every suggestion offered around him. His frustration grew with every passing minute until his eyes settled on Grace Bennett arranging white lilies near the stage entrance. A slow smile crossed his face, not because he had found an answer, but because he believed he had found amusement. Several musicians noticed him walking toward Grace and quietly gathered nearby. Curious staff members paused their work. Even a pair of wealthy donors visiting backstage turned to watch. Victor stopped a few feet from Grace, folded his arms with absolute confidence, and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Miss Bennett," he called with polished charm, "you spend every day listening to rehearsals. Perhaps tonight is finally your chance to become part of the show." Soft laughter immediately spread through the hallway. Grace looked up from the flowers with the same calm expression she always carried. She had no idea that the next few minutes would awaken a forgotten chapter of her life, and neither did anyone else standing in that magnificent theater. Grace Bennett looked at Victor Hayes with quiet curiosity, her hands still gently resting on the vase of fresh white lilies she had been arranging beside the stage entrance. The laughter surrounding them echoed softly through the backstage corridor, yet her expression never changed. She simply offered the same warm smile she greeted every employee with each morning. "I believe the audience came to hear extraordinary musicians," she answered politely. "I should finish preparing the theater." Victor smiled as though her response had made the moment even more entertaining. "Surely you have learned something after listening to rehearsals every day," he replied loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Perhaps you know at least one song." More quiet laughter spread among the gathering performers. A few musicians exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing that the joke had already gone far enough, but none of them challenged the respected music director. Grace lowered her eyes briefly before carefully placing the flowers onto a polished marble table. "I have always enjoyed music," she answered with complete honesty. "Then tonight is your lucky evening," Victor said with theatrical confidence. "Our opening soprano cannot arrive on time because of the storm. Until she gets here, perhaps you can entertain everyone for a few minutes." Several photographers raised their cameras, believing they were about to capture a humorous backstage moment. A young violinist quietly looked away, embarrassed by what was unfolding. Grace remained calm. She neither defended herself nor questioned Victor's intentions. Years of living with quiet dignity had taught her that arguing rarely changed proud hearts. While the conversation continued, the orchestra manager hurried past carrying revised schedules, confirming that the evening program was now dangerously behind schedule. Producers whispered anxiously near the wings. Stage technicians adjusted lighting cues while volunteers rushed between dressing rooms, searching for alternatives that seemed impossible to find. The elegant atmosphere of the gala was beginning to crack beneath growing pressure. Grace watched the anxious movement around her with genuine concern. She cared deeply about the theater because it had quietly become part of her life. Every hallway, every rehearsal room, every polished railing carried memories no one else could see. After finishing the flowers, she gently straightened a framed black and white photograph hanging beside the backstage corridor. It showed the Grand Crescent Theater decades earlier during a sold-out concert beneath the same magnificent chandeliers. An elderly stage carpenter noticed her carefully adjusting the frame and paused. "You always make certain that picture hangs perfectly," he said with a gentle smile. Grace looked at the photograph for a moment before answering softly, "Some memories deserve respect." The old carpenter studied her face with growing curiosity, sensing a familiarity he could not quite explain. Before he could ask another question, Victor's confident voice interrupted once again. "Miss Bennet," he called, stepping closer with folded arms. "If you truly enjoy music, then prove it. Walk onto that stage and give our guests something to remember." The surrounding hallway felt unusually quiet. Even those who had laughed moments earlier now waited to see how the quiet housekeeper would respond. Grace slowly lifted her eyes toward the glowing stage beyond the heavy crimson curtain. Warm golden light spilled across the polished wooden floor, and for the briefest moment, something deep within her seemed to awaken. Hidden beneath years of quiet service rested a part of her life that no one inside the theater had imagined still existed, and before another 10 minutes passed, that forgotten truth would begin changing every heart in the building. The backstage hallway grew quieter with every passing second as Grace Bennet continued looking toward the warm golden light spilling beneath the heavy crimson curtain. She did not see a stage waiting for her. She saw memories she had carefully locked away for more than 20 years. The polished wooden floor beneath her feet seemed strangely familiar, and the distant sound of the orchestra warming up awakened emotions she had spent years teaching herself to silence. Victor Hayes mistook her thoughtful expression for fear. A confident smile returned to his face. "What is the matter?" he asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Do not tell me you have changed your mind already. It is only one song. Surely someone who listens to rehearsals every day can manage that much." A few scattered laughs drifted through the corridor once again, although they sounded less certain than before. Grace slowly turned toward him and answered with complete sincerity, "If singing will help the evening continue for the audience, then I will do my best." Her calm reply surprised several musicians. There was no embarrassment in her voice, no anger, and no attempt to defend herself. She spoke with the peaceful confidence of someone accepting a responsibility rather than a challenge. Victor nodded with theatrical satisfaction before signaling the orchestra manager. "Prepare the stage," he announced. "Our unexpected guest performer is ready." The orchestra manager hesitated for a brief moment before quietly passing the instruction to the conductor. Around them, assistants hurried to adjust the revised program while photographers positioned themselves near the curtain, convinced they were about to capture an amusing moment that would entertain donors during the unexpected delay. Grace carefully removed the white housekeeping gloves she had been wearing throughout the evening and folded them neatly beside the vase of lilies. She gently smoothed the front of her simple navy uniform, not because she wished to impress anyone, but because she believed every audience deserved respect regardless of who stood before them. As she waited near the stage entrance, the elderly stage carpenter slowly approached once again. His weathered eyes rested upon her with growing uncertainty before he quietly asked, "Forgive me, but have you ever stood on this stage before?" Grace looked toward the magnificent auditorium hidden beyond the curtain and allowed herself a faint smile. "A very long time ago," she answered softly. Before the old man could ask another question, the stage manager called everyone into position. The orchestra took their seats beneath the brilliant lights while hundreds of elegantly dressed guests settled into the red velvet chairs filling the magnificent auditorium. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead as the master of ceremonies welcomed the audience and briefly explained the unexpected delay. Then Victor Hayes stepped confidently to the microphone with polished composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with an easy smile, "while we await our featured soprano, we have arranged a small surprise to begin the evening." Curious murmurs spread through the theater. Victor turned gracefully toward the curtain and extended one hand. "Please welcome one of our own." Grace closed her eyes for one slow breath. In her heart she heard her mother's gentle voice once more. "Do not sing so people will remember your name. Sing so someone leaves with hope." Peace settled over her completely. She opened her eyes, stepped forward through the crimson curtain, and walked alone into the brilliant golden spotlight while an audience that expected nothing more than a harmless joke unknowingly prepared to witness the performance that would forever change the history of the Grand Crescent Theater. Grace Bennett stood quietly beneath the brilliant golden spotlight, her simple navy housekeeping uniform contrasting with the elegance surrounding her. Hundreds of distinguished guests looked toward the stage with polite curiosity, expecting nothing more than a brief distraction before the evening's true performance could begin. Victor Hayes stepped away from the microphone with complete confidence, convinced the harmless joke would entertain the audience while buying precious time for the delayed program. He folded his arms near the edge of the stage and exchanged amused smiles with several important donors, certain that everything remained under his control. Grace gently looked toward the orchestra and offered the conductor a respectful nod. The experienced conductor hesitated for a brief moment before returning the gesture. Something about the quiet woman standing before him felt unexpectedly familiar. It was not simply her calm expression. It was the confidence with which she waited for the first measure, as though she understood every movement that was about to unfold. He slowly lifted his baton, and the orchestra began a soft orchestral introduction that drifted gracefully through the magnificent theater. Grace remained perfectly still, allowing every note to settle before taking a slow, peaceful breath. The audience waited with mild amusement. A few guests exchanged whispers. One photographer adjusted his camera, expecting to capture an awkward moment. Then Grace sang her first note. The sound rose effortlessly into the grand auditorium with extraordinary warmth and astonishing clarity. It did not force itself above the orchestra. Instead, it blended naturally with every instrument until the music seemed to breathe as one. Conversation stopped immediately. A gentleman reaching for his program froze without realizing it. A woman near the front row slowly lowered her glasses. The photographer quietly lowered his camera before taking a single photograph. The room went silent. Grace continued singing with remarkable control, each phrase flowing gently into the next with emotional honesty that could never be rehearsed. There was no trace of nervousness in her voice, only kindness, grace, and years of quiet experience hidden beneath simple clothing. The conductor widened his eyes almost imperceptibly before adjusting the orchestra to follow her interpretation instead of the printed score. Violinists exchanged stunned glances while maintaining flawless concentration. The principal cellist smiled with growing admiration as he realized they were accompanying someone whose artistry belonged among the greatest performers he had ever heard. Backstage, the performers who had quietly laughed only minutes earlier now stood completely motionless. The young violinist who had felt embarrassed earlier watched Grace with shining eyes, unable to believe the transformation taking place before everyone. Even the production assistants stopped moving through the corridors, so they would not interrupt the extraordinary moment unfolding beyond the curtain. Victor Hayes slowly unfolded his arms. The confidence that had carried him through the evening quietly disappeared as every passing phrase shattered another assumption he had made about the woman standing beneath the spotlight. He searched her face for uncertainty and found only peaceful concentration. He listened for mistakes and found only remarkable precision. Every elegant transition, every perfectly supported note, and every heartfelt expression revealed years of disciplined artistry impossible to imitate. As Grace reached the emotional heart of the song, the magnificent theater seemed to disappear, leaving only her voice and the quiet hope it carried into every corner of the room. Without anyone realizing exactly when it happened, amusement had become admiration, curiosity had become respect, and before the final note had even arrived, the audience already understood they were witnessing something that would remain in their memories for the rest of their lives. Grace Bennett allowed the melody to carry her forward with effortless grace, never reaching for attention, never trying to impress the audience that had expected her to become the evening's brief amusement. Every note flowed naturally into the next with remarkable warmth and emotional honesty, filling the Grand Crescent Theater with a presence far greater than the simple navy housekeeping uniform she still wore beneath the golden lights. The orchestra no longer accompanied a temporary replacement. They followed a true artist. The conductor adjusted his interpretation almost instinctively, allowing Grace's phrasing to guide every musician through the heart of the composition. Violins softened their tone to support her delicate expressions. The cellos deepened the emotional foundation beneath her voice, and the woodwinds blended with extraordinary sensitivity, as though they had rehearsed beside her for years instead of only discovering her moments earlier. Throughout the magnificent auditorium, astonishment quietly transformed into genuine admiration. A respected music critic slowly closed the leather notebook resting on his lap, because no written review seemed capable of capturing what he was witnessing. An elderly couple sitting near the front gently reached for each other's hands while listening with tears forming in their eyes. Several young music students leaned forward without blinking, hoping to remember every beautiful phrase they heard. Even the wealthy donors who had arrived expecting an elegant social event forgot about conversations, business relationships, and formal introductions as Grace's voice reached every corner of the theater. Backstage, absolute silence replaced the earlier laughter. The performers who had smiled at Victor Hayes's joke now stood shoulder to shoulder, unable to look away from the stage. The young violinist who had felt embarrassed only minutes before whispered softly, "She sings as though every word truly matters." No one answered because every person nearby already understood the truth. The elderly stage carpenter quietly removed his glasses and smiled through eyes filled with emotion. The familiar warmth in Grace's voice had finally awakened memories he thought time had erased forever. Victor Hayes remained motionless near the curtain, his expression changing with every passing measure. Confidence had completely disappeared from his face. Instead, disbelief slowly gave way to reluctant respect. He searched desperately for an explanation that could preserve his pride, but each perfectly controlled breath, each elegant transition, and each heartfelt phrase dismantled another assumption he had made about the quiet woman he believed he understood. Grace reached the emotional peak of the song with breathtaking control, allowing one sustained note to rise beneath the crystal chandeliers before gently settling into complete stillness. The final chord faded from the orchestra, and the conductor lowered his baton with remarkable care, unwilling to disturb the silence that followed. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the rare silence created only when hundreds of people experienced the same emotion at exactly the same moment. Victor slowly lowered his eyes, realizing that the woman he had tried to place beneath the dignity of the stage had quietly elevated everyone else instead. Grace stood peacefully before the audience, breathing calmly, her expression unchanged by the extraordinary moment surrounding her. She neither celebrated nor searched for approval. She simply offered a gentle smile filled with gratitude, unaware that within the next few seconds the entire theater would respond in a way that no program, no rehearsal, and no carefully planned performance could ever have predicted. For one unforgettable heartbeat, complete silence embraced the Grand Crescent Theater. The final note still seemed to float beneath the crystal chandeliers, refusing to disappear as though the building itself wanted to preserve the extraordinary moment forever. Grace Bennett lowered her eyes with quiet humility and gently folded her hands before her. She did not lift her chin in triumph or search the audience for admiration. She simply stood beneath the warm golden spotlight with the peaceful expression of a woman who had shared something deeply personal rather than accomplished something remarkable. Then from the front row, a single pair of hands began to applaud. The sound echoed clearly through the magnificent auditorium, Another guest slowly stood and joined the applause. Then another. Within seconds the entire theater rose together until hundreds of people stood shoulder to shoulder in a heartfelt standing ovation that seemed to shake the walls with gratitude, rather than excitement. Orchestra members placed their instruments carefully upon their laps before standing with genuine admiration. The conductor stepped away from his podium and applauded with a smile that reflected complete respect. Several musicians quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Grace looked across the audience with gentle surprise and placed one hand over her heart before offering a humble bow. She had not expected applause. She had only hoped the music would bring comfort to someone listening. Backstage, the performers who had quietly laughed earlier remained frozen in place. The young violinist who had felt embarrassed by Victor Hayes's joke whispered softly, "How could we have missed someone like her?" No one answered because no explanation seemed large enough. The elderly stage carpenter slowly walked toward Victor, his eyes never leaving Grace. "I knew I recognized her," he said quietly. "She stood on this very stage more than 20 years ago. She was one of the brightest young sopranos our theater had ever welcomed." Victor turned toward him with visible disbelief. The old carpenter continued, "After her mother became seriously ill, Grace left her career to care for her family. She walked away from concert halls without bitterness, and when life became quieter, she chose honest work here instead of chasing fame again. Most of the people who remembered those years have long since retired. That is why almost no one recognized her." Every word settled heavily upon Victor's conscience. Suddenly he remembered reading archived reviews early in his own career praising a gifted soprano named Grace Bennett, whose future had seemed limitless before she unexpectedly disappeared from public life. He had admired those reviews without ever imagining the quiet housekeeper working beside him every day was the very same artist. The master of ceremonies stepped carefully onto the stage, visibly moved by what had just unfolded. Looking toward the audience, he spoke with heartfelt sincerity. "Ladies and gentlemen, many longtime members of our theater family have just confirmed what we have all been fortunate enough to witness. The remarkable woman before you is Grace Bennett, an artist whose voice once graced this very stage, and whose humility has honored it once again tonight." A wave of astonished murmurs swept across the auditorium before the applause returned even louder than before. It was no longer applause for extraordinary talent alone. It was gratitude for a woman who had quietly carried greatness without demanding recognition, proving that genuine character shines brightest when the world has forgotten where to look. The applause continued rolling through the Grand Crescent Theater, until it became less like a celebration and more like a heartfelt expression of gratitude. Grace Bennett remained beneath the golden spotlight with the same quiet humility she had shown from the beginning of the evening. She smiled gently, placed one hand over her heart, and bowed once again before taking a small step backward, hoping to return quietly behind the curtain. She had never imagined becoming the center of attention again, and she certainly had never desired recognition at someone else's expense. Before she could leave the stage, Victor Hayes slowly walked toward her. The audience gradually became silent once more, sensing that another important moment was about to unfold. Gone was the commanding confidence that had defined him only minutes earlier. His shoulders no longer carried the certainty of a man who believed he controlled every outcome. Instead, they reflected the quiet weight of someone finally seeing his own mistake with complete honesty. Victor stopped a respectful distance from Grace and lowered his head before speaking. "Miss Bennett," he said softly, his voice carrying through the silent theater. "I have spent my entire career believing I could recognize greatness the moment I saw it. Tonight you showed me how completely wrong I was." The audience listened without interruption. Victor drew a slow breath before continuing. "I judged you by a uniform instead of your character. I assumed that because you worked behind the scenes you belonged there. I forgot that talent, dignity, and sacrifice cannot be measured by titles or appearances. I owe you a sincere apology." His words echoed through the magnificent auditorium with a sincerity that surprised even those who knew him best. Grace looked at him calmly. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no desire to make him feel smaller than he already did. She simply saw another human being learning a difficult lesson. After a brief silence, she answered with quiet kindness, "Mr. Hayes, music has always taught me that every voice matters, whether it comes from the center of the stage or from someone quietly working behind the curtain. We all help create the same performance. Victor slowly lifted his eyes. Grace continued gently. The audience remembers the singer, but the evening exists because hundreds of people give their best without expecting applause. Every musician, every stagehand, every technician, every usher, every cleaner, and every volunteer deserves respect long before anyone hears a single note. Those simple words settled deeply into every heart inside the theater. The conductor stepped forward and placed one hand over his heart before saying, "Tonight you reminded us that true artistry begins with humility." One by one, orchestra members nodded in agreement. The young violinist smiled through tears while the elderly stage carpenter quietly closed his eyes with gratitude, knowing the theater had finally remembered one of its brightest voices. Victor stepped aside and gestured respectfully toward Grace, inviting the audience to honor her once more. Instead of accepting the moment alone, Grace turned toward the orchestra and warmly motioned for every musician, every backstage employee, and every member of the theater staff to join her at the front of the stage. Hesitantly at first, then proudly they walked forward together. The audience immediately rose into another standing ovation, this time celebrating not only an extraordinary singer, but every unseen person whose dedication allowed beauty to exist. Under the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers, no one saw a housekeeper, a director, or a stagehand anymore. They simply saw people united by respect, reminding one another that the greatest performances are created not by pride, but by hearts willing to honor the value hidden within every ordinary face. The audience remained standing long after the applause softened into a gentle echo that drifted through the Grand Crescent Theater, like the final notes of an unforgettable melody. Grace Bennett smiled with quiet gratitude before stepping away from the center of the stage, hoping the evening could finally return to the celebration it had always been meant to become. The conductor respectfully escorted her toward the wings while orchestra members continued thanking her one by one, each handshake carrying sincere admiration instead of polite courtesy. As Grace reached the backstage corridor, the atmosphere felt entirely different from only an hour earlier. The performers who had once viewed her as an ordinary housekeeper now greeted her with warm smiles and genuine respect. The young violinist hurried forward and quietly said, "Miss Bennett, your performance reminded me why I chose music in the first place." Grace gently squeezed her hand and answered, "Never let applause become your reason for playing. Let hope be your reason instead." The young musician nodded with tears shining in her eyes, understanding that the lesson reached far beyond music itself. Nearby, the elderly stage carpenter carefully removed the faded black and white photograph from the hallway wall and carried it toward Grace. "I think this belongs with you tonight," he said softly. Grace looked at the photograph showing a much younger version of herself standing beneath the same crystal chandeliers beside her late mother after an early performance. She smiled warmly before shaking her head. "No," she replied. "Leave it exactly where it has always been. Let it remind everyone that beautiful memories belong to this theater, not to any one person." The old carpenter quietly returned the photograph to its place, understanding exactly what she meant. Across the backstage hallway, Victor Hayes remained standing alone for several moments before slowly approaching Grace once more. This time there was no audience watching, no microphone, and no reason to protect his reputation. "May I ask you one question?" he said respectfully. Grace nodded. Victor looked toward the empty stage before speaking. "After everything I said to you tonight, why did you still choose to help me?" Grace reflected for a moment before answering. "Because the audience deserved music more than they deserved our pride. My mother always taught me that when someone offers you the chance to create something beautiful, do not allow another person's mistake to stop you." Victor lowered his eyes, deeply moved by the simplicity of her answer. For the first time in many years, he realized that leadership was not proven by commanding others but by serving something greater than oneself. As the evening continued, the delayed featured soprano finally arrived at the theater, apologizing sincerely for the unavoidable travel disruption. After learning everything that had happened, she quietly walked to Grace, embraced her warmly, and thanked her for preserving the spirit of the gala. Together they stood beside the orchestra for the closing performance, sharing the stage with mutual respect rather than competition. The audience responded with another heartfelt ovation, not because they had witnessed extraordinary voices alone, but because they had witnessed extraordinary character. As the final guests slowly departed beneath the glowing chandeliers, conversations filled the marble lobby with a different kind of excitement. No one spoke about expensive gowns, distinguished donors, or perfect performances. They spoke about the quiet woman who had reminded an entire theater that genuine greatness never needs to announce itself, because humility always carries a voice powerful enough to be heard by every heart willing to listen. Several weeks passed after the unforgettable evening at the Grand Crescent Theater, yet its quiet influence continued, reaching far beyond the final applause. Newspapers praised the remarkable performance that had unexpectedly become the defining moment of the annual Harmony for Hope Gala. But those who had truly witnessed the evening spoke far less about the music than they did about the lesson it carried. Visitors returning to the theater noticed subtle changes almost immediately. Every employee, from the ushers greeting guests at the entrance to the technicians working high above the stage, was introduced with the same respect once reserved only for featured performers. Housekeeping staff no longer moved unnoticed through crowded hallways. Orchestra members paused to thank them. Donors learned their names. Performers greeted them each morning with genuine appreciation. The atmosphere inside the historic building gradually became warmer, because everyone understood that greatness depended upon countless unseen acts of dedication. Victor Hayes remained true to the promise he had silently made to himself on the night Grace Bennett transformed his understanding of leadership. Before every rehearsal, he personally welcomed every department, reminding musicians and visiting artists that every successful performance belonged equally to those beneath the spotlight and those working quietly behind it. His reputation changed as well. People still admired his artistic excellence, but they now respected his humility even more. Whenever someone praised him for the remarkable gala, Victor always answered with the same quiet sentence: "The greatest lesson of my career came from someone I failed to recognize." Grace continued living exactly as she always had. She returned each morning wearing the same simple navy housekeeping uniform, carefully arranging fresh white lilies, polishing brass railings, and preparing rehearsal rooms before the first musicians arrived. Many prestigious concert halls invited her to return to the stage after hearing about the extraordinary performance, and several respected recording companies expressed sincere interest in working with her. Grace thanked each person warmly, accepting only a handful of special charity performances whose purpose matched the values her mother had taught her long ago. Fame no longer held any power over her heart, because she had already discovered something far more meaningful than recognition. Occasionally, after evening rehearsals ended and the magnificent theater grew quiet once again, the conductor would invite Grace to sing one final piece while only the orchestra remained. Those private performances became treasured moments shared among friends, rather than public spectacles. No reporters attended. No cameras flashed. The music simply filled the empty auditorium with the same warmth that had changed so many lives on that unforgettable night. The elderly stage carpenter often stood quietly near the wings, smiling each time Grace's voice echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. One evening he gently straightened the old framed photograph hanging backstage before whispering, "Welcome home." Grace looked at the familiar picture, smiled softly, and continued down the hallway carrying another vase of fresh white lilies. She never asked for applause because she no longer needed it. Her dignity had never depended upon standing ovations. It had always lived inside the kindness she offered others, the humility she carried through every ordinary day, and the quiet strength that allowed her to answer disrespect with grace. Years later, people would remember that remarkable gala not because of the famous guests who attended or the carefully planned performances printed in the official program. They remembered the ordinary woman who reminded an entire theater that true greatness often walks unnoticed through everyday life, waiting only for one honest moment to reveal itself. And from that evening forward, whenever someone passed a quiet employee without offering a greeting, another voice would gently remind them that extraordinary stories are often hidden behind the simplest faces, and that respect given freely is one of the most beautiful performances any person can ever offer.